In the quaint cobblestone streets of Elmswood, a small gathering convened in the warm, amber-lit living room of Joanna, a local historian and the unspoken matriarch of the group. Her home, filled with antique books and artifacts, served as a meeting point for those enthralled by the mysteries of the town, particularly that of the Whispering Manor. Joanna, a woman in her late 40s, with an inquisitive glint in her eye, sat at the head of the oak table. She was joined by Alex, a young filmmaker with a penchant for the paranormal, Sarah, a skeptical journalist with a sharp wit, and Michael, a tech-savvy drone operator with a fascination for haunted locations. They were united by a common goal: to delve into the enigma of the Whispering Manor and create a documentary that would unveil its secrets. As the evening set in, Joanna spread out old maps and documents on the table. The group leaned in, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the table lamp. "Whispering Manor," Joanna began, her voice steady, yet tinged with unease, "is more than just a dilapidated structure. It's a repository of unspoken horrors and untold stories." She pointed to an old photograph of the manor. Built in the late 1800s, it was once the jewel of Elmswood, but as you all know, no one has entered it in the last 50 years. They say you can see the silhouettes of the lost souls at the windows, silently screaming into the void. Alex, his eyes wide with fascination, interjected. "And that's what we need to capture. The essence of the manor. Its eerie presence. This could be groundbreaking." Sarah, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "Or it could be a wild goose chase. You know, the legends are probably exaggerated." Joanna nodded, acknowledging Sarah's doubts. "Perhaps there's truth in the roots of every legend. The manor was built on a land that was said to be cursed by the local tribes. They believed it was a place where the veil between our world and the spirit world was thin." Michael, who had been fiddling with his drone controller, looked up. "Do we have any idea about what kind of curse it is? Something that could give us a lead on how we approach this?" "The details are murky," Joanna replied, sifting through her papers. "But it is believed that the curse was cast to avenge a betrayal, something unjustly in a family's history, leading to a vengeful spirit binding itself to the house." The group fell into a contemplative silence, each lost in their thoughts about the upcoming expedition. Joanna finally broke the silence. "We need to be careful. If we're going to uncover the truth about the Whispering Manor, we must respect its history and the forces that may still linger there." With a plan beginning to form, the group agreed to meet at dawn. They would venture to the Whispering Manor, armed with cameras, recording equipment, and an unwavering desire to unveil the shadows of the past. As they departed, the wind outside picked up, whispering through the trees as if carrying a secret from the manor itself. Little did they know, their journey would be more harrowing and revealing than any of them could have imagined. As the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and gold, the team gathered at the edge of the overgrown path that led to the Whispering Manor. The air was crisp, and a thin mist hovered over the ground, lending an eerie atmosphere to the beginning of their expedition. Equipped with their state-of-the-art cameras, drones, and an air of determination, they approached the manor with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The manor itself loomed in the distance, its once grand facade now marred by decay and neglect. "Let's get everything rolling," Alex announced, his camera already capturing the surrounding scenery. "Remember, we need to document every angle, every possible entry point. This footage is crucial." Michael piloted his drone, sending it soaring above the manor, its camera panning over the decrepit roof and the surrounding barren landscape. Sarah, meanwhile, walked along the perimeter, her handheld camera meticulously recording the cracked walls and the boarded-up windows. The manor stood silent, an imposing sentinel guarding untold secrets. Its windows, dusty and broken, offered no glimpse into the darkness within. As the drone hovered near a window, Michael squinted at his controller screen, hoping for a sign, a movement, anything. But there was nothing. Just the silent, eerie stillness of the abandoned house. After several hours of filming, the team regrouped. "I don't get it," Sarah said, frustration evident in her voice. "There's nothing. No movements, no shadow, nothing that legends talked about." Alex reviewed his footage, scanning through the frames with a growing sense of disappointment. "It's like the manor is just a manor. Maybe we're in the wrong place." The entrance to the manor, a heavy wooden door, was securely locked, its padlock rusted but firm. "We can't break in," Joanna said firmly. "We need to respect the law and the history of this place. Let's head back and review everything thoroughly. There might be something we've missed." As the team packed up, the manor stood unmoved, its secrets tightly sealed behind its decaying walls. The journey back was quiet, each member lost in their own thoughts, wondering if their quest was in vain. But at Joanna's house, they gathered around the large screen, playing back the footage. The high-definition images showed nothing but the lifeless exterior of the manor, the drone footage offering aerial views of a silent, unyielding structure. "It's like the manor's mocking us," Michael muttered, disappointment lacing his words. "We can't give up yet," Alex said, trying to inject some optimism into the group. "Let's plan another visit, maybe at night. They say that's when the manor truly comes alive." As they left for the night, a sense of unease lingered in the air. The Whispering Manor, in its silent vigil, had given away nothing. But the team was not ready to surrender. Little did they know that the manor was far from done with them, and their next visit would be far more than they bargained for. The evening found Joanna alone in her study, surrounded by piles of old books and manuscripts, the weight of her thoughts as heavy as the silence in the room. "I need some evidence," she murmured, a mix of determination and worry in her voice. She feared her team might lose interest in the documentary if they didn't uncover something soon. Resolved, Joanna grabbed her camera and a small flashlight, setting out into the night towards the Whispering Manor. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the path, making her journey feel even more solitary and foreboding. Upon reaching the manor, she set up her camera, aiming it at the windows. The manor, bathed in the moonlight, seemed to take on a life of its own, its walls whispering secrets of ages past. Joanna's heart raced as she scanned the windows with her binoculars, and then she saw it. An image of an old woman, her face contorted in a silent scream, appearing in the top-floor window. Gasping, Joanna quickly aimed her camera at the window, but the image had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Her heart pounding, she approached the manor's entrance, only to find the door slightly ajar, the padlock and chains lying broken on the ground. "Hello?" Joanna called out tentatively as she stepped inside. The interior of the manor was engulfed in an unnatural silence, so profound that even the sounds from outside ceased to exist. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing dust-laden furniture and cobwebbed corners. Then she saw it again, the figure of the old woman, draped in tattered rags, moving towards her at an alarming speed. The ghostly woman's mouth was wide open, as if screaming, but no sound emerged. Panic surged through Joanna, and she turned to flee. But the layout of the manor had inexplicably changed, the corridors twisting into a labyrinth maze. The next morning, Joanna's friends, worried after not hearing from her, arrived at her house. Alex knocked on the door, calling her name, but there was no answer. They searched the house, finding her study littered with research on the manor, but Joanna was nowhere to be seen. "Something's wrong," Sarah said, a sense of dread settling over the group. "We need to go to the manor. She might have gone there." As they hurried towards the Whispering Manor, a sense of foreboding gripped them. The manor, once a subject of their documentary, had now become a much more personal and terrifying enigma. Joanna's fate, intertwined with the mysteries of the Whispering Manor, was yet to be uncovered, and her friends were about to step into a realm beyond their wildest fears. Under a sky heavy with clouds, Alex, Sarah, and Michael arrived at the Whispering Manor, a sense of urgency propelling them forward. The manor, in the bleak light of day, stood as a silent sentinel, its secrets locked behind walls of decaying stone and wood. They scanned the exterior, their eyes searching for any sign of Joanna. The windows, with their cracked panes and dusty seals, offered no clues. "She has to be in here somewhere," Michael said, his voice tinged with worry as he flew his drone around the property, hoping for a better vantage point. Approaching the front door, Alex examined the lock and chains. "It's bolted shut, just like when we were here the other day," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. "There's no way she could have gotten in here." Sarah, her brow furrowed in concern, added, "Let's head back. We need to think things through, figure out what to do next. Maybe she went somewhere else." As they turned to leave, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path, they remained oblivious till a chilling scene above them. In the top-floor window, a faint, ghostly image appeared. It was Joanna, her face twisted in a silent scream, her hands pressed against the glass as if desperately trying to reach out to her friends. But her screams went unheard, lost in the void of the manor's curse. The image of Joanna flickered like a candle flame in the wind, before vanishing once again into the shadows of the house. The trio walked away, the manor looming in the background, its windows like vacant eyes watching their retreat. Unbeknownst to them, they had just missed a vital clue to the mystery that had now enveloped their lives. The Whispering Manor, with its silent walls and hidden terrors, had claimed another soul, and its appetite for the unknown seemed far from sated. Back in Elmswood, the friends exhausted every avenue in their frantic search for Joanna, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. The feeling of unease grew stronger with each passing hour. "We need to get into that manor," Michael insisted, his voice laced with determination. "She may have gotten trapped inside. Something's wrong. I can feel it." "You're talking about breaking and entering," Sarah countered, her tone laced with concern and disbelief. But Alex, driven by a mix of worry and resolve, was already on his feet. "Let's go," he said firmly. "I just can't sit here and do nothing." Sarah hesitated, torn between fear and the urge to help. "I'll stay here," she finally said, "in case she calls or comes home." So Alex and Michael set off towards the manor, the weight of their mission pressing heavily upon them. As they approached the imposing front door, they tried to break the lock, but the chains held strong, unyielding to their efforts. "There's a broken window around the back," Michael remembered, recalling his drone footage. "We can get in through there." Carefully, they maneuvered through the cracked window, Michael leading the way. As he stepped inside, he was immediately struck by the eerie silence that enveloped the manor. The sounds of the world outside seems to have been swallowed whole by the oppressive stillness within. Alex followed suit, clambering through the window. He opened his mouth to speak to Michael, but no sound came out. Confused and alarmed, Michael tried to respond, but he too found himself enveloped in the same inexplicable silence. Panic began to set in. Alex, his eyes wide with fear, turned to escape through the window they had entered, but it was firmly shut, locked from the outside world. In desperation, he wrapped his hand in his jacket and punched the window, hoping to shatter it. But the glass was as hard as steel, unyielding to his efforts. The two men stared at each other in terror, their silent screams echoing in their minds. Then, from the shadows of the long, dark hallway, a figure emerged. An old woman, draped in tattered rags, floating towards them with a ghostly speed. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, her face twisted in agony and despair. Alex and Michael, trapped and voiceless, could only watch in horror as the spectral figure drew closer, its silent scream a chilling reminder of the manor's dark secret. The reality of the situation was now terrifyingly clear. They were not alone in the Whispering Manor, and escape might not be an option. As the hours ticked by with no word from Alex or Michael, Sarah's worry turned into a gnawing sense of dread. She attempted to call their phones repeatedly, but each call went unanswered, echoing the void of uncertainty. The silence from her friends was deafening, and she knew she had to take action. Determined to uncover more about the Whispering Manor, Sarah turned to the internet, sifting through the layers of urban myths and ghost stories that shrouded the house's true history. It was then that a spark of inspiration struck her. She decided to delve into the records of the previous owners of the manor. Her search led her to the Dwights, an old family with deep roots in the town's history. She scoured through the archives and public records, piecing together the fragmented past of the family. There were no living relatives, but in her search, Sarah stumbled upon a chilling tale. The story spoke of Mr. Dwight, a tyrannical figure who imposed a cruel rule of silence over the women and servants. If anyone dared to speak, they were subjected to brutal floggings. The tale took a darker turn, with the account of the Dwight children who, in a fit of vengeance, had murdered their father after discovering he had flogged their mother so severely that she lost her ability to speak. Abigail Dwight, Sarah whispered to herself, a shiver running down her spine. She may be the key to this. Armed with this new knowledge, and a resolve steeled by fear for her friends, Sarah decided to confront the horrors of the manor alone. She gathered a few essential tools, including a camera and a voice recorder, in hopes of documenting anything she might encounter. As she approached the manor, the sun was setting, casting long, ominous shadows across the path. The manor stood in front of her, its windows dark and foreboding. With each step, Sarah felt the weight of the manor's tragic history pressing down on her. She found the same broken window through which Alex and Michael had entered, and climbed through, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence enveloped her immediately, a suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. Sarah moved cautiously through the dimly lit corridors, her flashlight dancing off the decrepit walls and faded portraits. She could feel the oppressive atmosphere of the manor, as if the very air was thick with the whispers of the past. "Abigail Dwight!" Sarah called out softly, her voice quivering in the silence. "I know your pain, I'm here to help." As she ventured deeper into the manor, Sarah could feel the presence of something unseen, a lingering sorrow that permeated the air. She knew that whatever secrets the Whispering Manor held, she was about to come face to face with them. Her friend's fate hung precariously in the balance as she stepped further into the heart of the darkness. Sarah's heart raced as she entered the dining room, her flashlight illuminating the grand, dusty space. There, she witnessed a ghostly apparition that made her blood run cold. A man lying dead at the dining table, evidently poisoned. Standing over him were two spectral figures, a young woman and a young man dressed in 18th century clothing, their faces etched with both horror and relief. As quickly as the image appeared, it faded away, but not before the young adults turned their ghostly gazes towards Sarah, acknowledging her presence. The silence in the manor was overwhelming, a stark reminder that the world outside no longer reached her ears. With each step, Sarah felt as if she was delving deeper into the manor's haunted history. Moving cautiously, she continued through the house, eventually entering the kitchen area. There, she was confronted with 3 more ghostly figures, their faces and bodies marked with the scars of whippings. They looked at Sarah with sorrowful eyes, and one by one placed a finger to their lips in a silent gesture of shushing. The message was clear. Silence was a rule, a curse that bound them. Terrified, Sarah quickly exited the kitchen. Her search for her friends led her upstairs, where the atmosphere grew even heavier, the shadows deeper. Reaching the top of the stairs, she noticed one of the doors slightly ajar. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by the fading light coming through the window. In the center, on the floor, sat an old woman, her ghostly form weeping in silence. As Sarah watched, the old woman lifted her head, her face contorting into a silent scream, a chilling image of fear and desperation. Abruptly, the old woman's expression changed to one of intense fear. She looked past Sarah towards the door, then back at her, and mouthed a single word with urgent clarity. "Hide!" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to look behind her, expecting to see some new horror. The old woman's warning was clear, and Sarah knew she had to act quickly. The manor was revealing its dark past, but it also held her friends somewhere within its cursed walls. As she searched for a hiding place, Sarah's mind raced, piecing together the tragic stories the manor whispered, hoping it would lead her to Alex, Michael, and Joanna, and to a way to break the suffocating silence of the whispering manor. Crouching in the cramped space of a small cupboard, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the ghostly image of the old woman faded away, leaving her in a suffocating silence. Peering through a gap in the cupboard, her eyes widened in fear at the sight that unfolded before her. In the center of the room stood a menacing, spectral figure of a man, his expression stern and unyielding. He clutched a whip, which he rhythmically struck against his hand. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she realized this was Mr. Dwight, the tyrant of the manor, whose presence still dominated the house, even in death. His ghostly visage symbolized the oppressive silence that had cursed the manor. As quickly as it appeared, the apparition vanished, leaving Sarah alone again in the eerie quietude. She cautiously emerged from the cupboard, her every move silent in the manor's unnerving stillness. Approaching the window, she attempted to scream for help, but no sound escaped her lips. The manor's curse of silence was absolute. With a growing sense of dread, Sarah ventured back down the stairs, her steps leading her to an old basement, a part of the manor she hadn't explored yet. The air grew colder as she descended, the weight of the house's tragic history pressing down on her. In the dim light of the basement, she saw them. Her 3 friends, Alex, Michael, and Joanna, stood motionless, facing the wall, their backs to Sarah. Frantically, she tried to call out to them, but her voice was swallowed by the silence. In unison, they turned towards her, their faces pale and haunted. Then, in a chilling moment, each raised a finger to their lips in a silent shh, before turning back to face the wall. The realization hit Sarah with terrifying clarity. Her friends were trapped, bound by the same spectral silence that gripped the manor. The curse of Mr. Dwight lingered, a relentless force, ensuring that no voice could be heard within these walls. Sarah's mind raced as she stood in the gloomy basement, surrounded by her motionless friends. She needed to find a way to break the curse, to release them and herself from the manor's grasp. The key, she knew, lay in the manor's tragic past and the spirits that haunted its walls. With a renewed sense of purpose, Sarah steeled herself for the daunting task ahead, to confront the manor's ghosts and uncover the secret to break in its eerie silence. Breathless and terrified, Sarah spun around to find Mr. Dwight, standing ominously behind her, his long black whip in hand. His face was a mask of stern, unyielding terror. Without a moment's hesitation, he raised his arm and brought the whip down on Sarah with a vicious strike. She felt a searing pain as a bloodied mark appeared on her face. She tried to scream, but the manor's curse held her voice prisoner, leaving her in silent agony. As Mr. Dwight raised his whip for another strike, Sarah darted past him, her every instinct screaming to escape. She had a sudden thought: the dining room, the site of Mr. Dwight's demise. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope there. Bursting into the dining room, she was met with an oppressive energy, different from anywhere else in the house. Mr. Dwight materialized in the center of the room, his whip ready to unleash more pain. In a desperate move, Sarah grabbed a silver serving plate and hurled it at the ghostly figure. It passed right through him, but as it crashed against the wall, it produced a loud, resounding sound. To her astonishment, Mr. Dwight clutched his ears in pain. Seizing the opportunity, she smashed a china plate on the floor, the crash echoing through the room. Each sound seemed to weaken the ghostly tyrant as he fell to his knees in agony. Sarah continued her assault, breaking a cup and a smaller plate, each crash a symphony of pain for Mr. Dwight. But soon there were no more plates to throw. She tried to scream, but her voice was still trapped in silence. Racing to retrieve the silver serving dish from across the room, she felt the cruel lash of Mr. Dwight's whip across her back. She fell, each subsequent strike pushing her further into darkness. As she lay there, consciousness slipping away, the last thing she saw was Mr. Dwight's ghostly form, his dominance over the manor unbroken. Days later, a group of curious friends stood outside the Whispering Manor, discussing the old ghost stories. "Nothing but kids' tales," one of them remarked dismissively. As they walked away, lost in laughter and skepticism, they failed to notice the ghostly image of a young woman in the top window. Sarah, screaming in internal silence for help. And so, the Whispering Manor continued its silent vigil, its secrets and horrors trapped within, waiting for the next unwary soul to uncover its tragic past. Chapter 1. The Discovery of Hawthorne Village. In the heart of the city's antique district, nestled between a quaint bookshop and a fading mural, stood a peculiar little store, known to few but revered by collectors. Its window, cluttered with curiosities from bygone eras, had always drawn the attention of Jonathan Hargrove, a passionate model village enthusiast with an eye for the extraordinary. Jonathan's fascination with model villages began as a child, a magical world in miniature that he could control and bring to life. Over the years, his collection had grown, filling a special room in his modest apartment. Each village had its own story, its own charm, but Jonathan always sought something truly unique, something that whispered tales of yesteryears. On this crisp autumn afternoon, as Jonathan pushed open the creaking door of the antique shop, a peculiar sight caught his eye. Tucked away in a dimly lit corner was a model village, unlike any he had seen before. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each building meticulously detailed, each tiny figure brimming with character. But amidst the quaint cottages and bustling town square, one figure stood out like a shadow in the light of day. It was a miniature, cloaked man, face a haunting skull, an unsettling contrast to the otherwise idyllic village. The figure sent a chill down Jonathan's spine, yet he couldn't look away. There was an enigmatic allure to it, an unspoken story that beckoned him. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a weathered face and knowing eyes, noticed Jonathan's interest. "Ah, you found our Hawthorne village," he said in a voice as old as time. "A rare piece, that. Been here longer than I can recall. The chap who made it, they say he was a bit of an oddball, loved his creations more than people." Jonathan was drawn in. The mystery, the craftsmanship, the oddity of the skull-faced figure, it was irresistible. Without hesitation, he purchased the Hawthorne village, the shopkeeper giving him an odd, knowing smile as he wrapped it up. Back in his apartment, Jonathan carefully placed the Hawthorne village among his collection. The skull-faced figure seemed to watch him as he worked, an eerie sentinel amidst the cheerful miniature people. He positioned the village so that it was central, its intricate details deserving of the spotlight. As night fell, Jonathan sat in his armchair, a cup of tea in hand, admiring his new acquisition. The miniature lights of the village flickered on, casting a warm glow across the room, but in the back of his mind, a question lingered. Who was the cloaked figure with the skull face? And why did it feel so unnervingly alive? That night, Jonathan's dreams were troubled, filled with whispers and the cobblestone streets of Hawthorne village. Unseen eyes watched him from the shadows, and he could swear he heard the faint, distant sound of a bell tolling from the miniature chapel. The village was more than just a model. It was a story yet to be told, a mystery that beckoned him deeper. Chapter 2. Shadows among the miniatures. The morning light filtered through Jonathan's window, casting a golden hue over his treasured collection of model villages. With a steaming cup of coffee in hand, he set about his daily ritual of admiring and dusting each miniature world. His gaze lingered fondly over the charming streets and tiny, intricately crafted buildings. However, as his eyes settled on Hawthorne village, a jolt of unease ran through him. The cloaked figure with the skull face was missing. Panic and confusion set in. Had he misplaced it? Jonathan meticulously searched around the village, hoping he had simply dropped the figure. After a fruitless search around Hawthorne village, his eyes caught something chilling in another model set across the room. There, standing in a bustling market square of a different village, was the missing cloaked figure. "How?" Jonathan murmured, his mind racing with bewildered thoughts. Carefully, he picked up the figure, examining it closely. It was indeed the same one from Hawthorne village. Perplexed and slightly unnerved, he placed the figure back in its original setting, ensuring it was secure. Shaking off the eerie incident as a trick of the mind, Jonathan decided to go for his daily walk, hoping the fresh air would clear his thoughts. The city was alive with the usual hum of activity, but Jonathan couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. As he strolled through a quaint street lined with old bookstores and cafes, he caught a glimpse of a cloaked figure across the road. It was oddly familiar, strikingly resembling the miniature he had just repositioned. Heart pounding, Jonathan quickened his pace, crossing the road to get a closer look. The figure stood still, its presence ominous, but as he neared, in a blink of an eye, it vanished, leaving Jonathan standing alone on the bustling street, bewildered and unnerved. Trying to rationalize the day's strange occurrences as a result of stress or lack of sleep, Jonathan headed home. The day had taken its toll on him, and he longed for the comfort of his apartment. Upon his return, a sense of dread washed over him as he looked over his model villages. Once again, the cloaked figure from Hawthorne village was gone. His eyes frantically searched and found it, now positioned in a different model, a serene countryside scene. The figure stood at the edge of a miniature forest, its skull face eerily turned towards the direction of Hawthorne Village. Confusion and fear mingled in Jonathan's mind. This was impossible, he thought. Figures don't move on their own. He felt a growing sense of being part of something unexplainable, something that defied logic. Exhausted and overwhelmed, Jonathan decided to call it a day. He left the figure where it was, too tired to contemplate the day's mysteries any further. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, the image of the cloaked figure haunted the edges of his dreams, a silent, ominous watcher in a world of miniatures. Chapter 3. Nightmares and Realities. The night embraced Jonathan in its quiet fold, but rest was far from his reach. In his sleep, he found himself in a surreal, mist-enshrouded world. It was Hawthorne Village, his latest model, but unlike anything he had ever seen. The quaint charm was replaced by an eerie stillness, a ghostly version of his miniature creation. There were no other models, no tiny people bustling about. It was just him, alone in the fog. The streets of the village, now life-size around him, felt both familiar and alien. Jonathan's footsteps echoed on the cobblestone paths as he wandered aimlessly, the mist swirling around him. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the silence was oppressive. Then, out of the mist, he saw it, the figure of the cloaked man with a skull face. It was no longer a mere model. It was alive, its movements sinister and purposeful. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, fear gripping him as he realized the figure was aware of his presence. In terror, he ran through the streets of the village, ducking behind buildings and darting through alleys, trying to escape the relentless pursuit of the skull-faced figure. The dream, if it was a dream, felt vividly real, each breath heavy with the damp, cold air of the village. "It's just a dream. I need to wake up," Jonathan whispered to himself, his voice shaking. He peered around the corner of a cottage, only to see the figure moving faster, directly towards him. Desperation set in as Jonathan pinched himself, trying to force himself awake, but it had no effect. He looked up in horror as the figure closed the distance, standing right next to him. The skull face was terrifyingly real, the hollow eye sockets seeming to stare into his soul. The shock of that moment, the palpable fear and the closeness of the spectral figure jolted Jonathan awake. His heart racing, he sat up in bed, gasping for air. The room was dark, the familiar contours of his bedroom barely visible in the moonlight. It took him a moment to orient himself, to recognize the safety of his own home. Driven by a need to confirm reality, Jonathan raced to his model room, his hands trembling. The early morning light cast a pale glow across the miniature worlds he had created. His eyes frantically searched for Hawthorne Village. There it was, peaceful and still in the dim light, but his heart skipped a beat when he saw the cloaked figure. It was positioned beside a small cottage, the very one he had hidden behind in his dream. A chill ran down his spine. Was it just a coincidence, or was something unexplainable happening? The lines between his dreams and reality were blurring, and Jonathan felt a growing sense of dread. What was this figure? Why was it haunting him both in his sleep and in the waking world? He stood there, staring at the village, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Chapter 4. The Creator's Secret. Jonathan carefully lifted Hawthorne Village, turning it over in his hands. His heart raced as he scrutinized every detail, searching for answers. On the bottom of the model, etched into the wood, he found something he hadn't noticed before. Hawthorne Village, a model by Edmund Gray. Below the name, a chilling line of text sent shivers down his spine. Where souls live forever. He held the figure of the cloaked man with the skull face, examining it. It was a simple model, nothing outwardly remarkable about it, yet it seemed to hold a sinister aura. Jonathan replaced it with a sigh. "It must be me. I must be going through something," he muttered to himself, trying to dismiss the growing unease within him. That evening, determined to shake off the bizarre occurrences, Jonathan decided on an early night. He set up a soothing, 8-hour-long track of relaxing music from YouTube, hoping it would ease him into a peaceful sleep. "An early night without worry. That's what I need," he told himself. But as soon as he drifted off, he was back in Hawthorne Village. The village was empty, wrapped in a ghostly mist that seemed to move with a life of its own. He wandered among the houses, drawn inexplicably to the church at the heart of the village. Inside, he discovered a diary, its pages yellowed with age. It was the diary of Edmund Gray, the creator of Hawthorne Village. Trembling, Jonathan read the haunting words. "I have poured my soul into this ghostly model, so that in the future others will be attracted to the village. They will place the village close to them, and when they sleep, the village will drain their souls, giving me life to live beyond my years. One day, I shall be able to leave the village and walk once again amongst the living world." An icy chill ran down Jonathan's spine. Was this real? Was it possible to create a ghost village, designed to live after death? His heart pounded as he grappled with the terrifying possibility. Then, a loud slam echoed through the church. Jonathan turned to see the cloaked figure standing by the doorway. "No!" he screamed. The figure began to glide towards him, floating eerily above the ground. Panicked, Jonathan looked around frantically, but there was nowhere to run. "Who are you?" Jonathan cried out. The figure looked straight at him, its skull face more terrifying than ever. It was Edmund Gray, the creator of the village, his eyes hollow and soulless. Suddenly, another noise broke the silence, a loud, deafening banging. Jonathan awoke with a start, his heart racing. The sound was coming from his front door. He dragged himself out of bed, still disoriented and half in the world of his nightmare. He opened the door to a delivery man who simply said, "Delivery," before scooting off. Jonathan was left standing there, holding a parcel, his mind racing. He sat down, the parcel unopened beside him, unsure of what to do next. The lines between dream and reality were blurring, and the terror of the village and its creator haunted him. What was happening to him? Was it all in his head, or was there something more sinister at play? The questions swirled in his mind as he stared at the unopened parcel, the weight of the unknown heavy in the air. Chapter 5. The Turning of Tables. Jonathan sat, a 10-year-old boy, in the safety of his room, surrounded by his small model village. Earlier that day, he had been bullied at school, pinned down by larger boys who taunted him for his size. "You're so tiny. We're much bigger than you," they jeered, their slaps leaving red marks on his face. The cruelty of their words and actions imprinted a deep, painful scar in young Jonathan's memory. In his room, he stood over his model village, the miniature figures defenseless before him. Echoing the bully's words, he whispered, "You're so tiny. I am bigger than you," before his hand came crashing down on the tiny village, destroying the figures in a moment of misguided anger and hurt. Years later, in the present day, Jonathan stood over Hawthorne Village, his gaze fixed on the cloaked figure with the skull face. The memories of his childhood, the feelings of helplessness, and the recent terror mixed into a potent cocktail of emotion. "You are tiny. I am much bigger than you." He echoed the words from his past, this time directed at the figure that had haunted his nights. Without thinking, his fist came down hard on Hawthorne Village, shattering the model and the cloaked figure into pieces. A sense of power and relief washed over him as he collected the broken remnants and threw them into the bin. We don't pick on smaller kids, and we don't get into people's dreams, he declared, a sense of finality in his voice. Feeling a weight lifted, Jonathan went about his day, convinced that the nightmare was over, that he had conquered his fears and the haunting presence of the village. He returned home late and entered his model village room, expecting peace. But there it was, Hawthorne Village intact, with the cloaked figure staring back at him. "Impossible," he uttered in disbelief. Anger surged within him as he raised his fist to smash the model again. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. He found himself in the model village, small, vulnerable. His room loomed large around him, a giant's world. And there, towering over the village, was a gigantic version of the cloaked figure, their roles reversed. Jonathan was now the tiny model, and the figure was the giant. Fear gripped Jonathan as he looked up at the looming figure. The giant raised its fist, mirroring Jonathan's earlier action. As the fist came crashing down towards him and the village, Jonathan's heart raced with terror. The realization hit him. This was the trap of Hawthorne Village, the curse of Edmund Gray, coming to its dreadful fruition. The village was not just a model, it was a snare, and he was now its captive, caught in a twisted fate of his own making. Chapter 6. The cycle continues. The bell above the door of the old antique shop tinkled, signaling the arrival of a new customer. The man, an avid collector of peculiarities and trinkets, stepped in, his eyes immediately drawn to the small model village, displayed prominently on a shelf. Intrigued, he approached the miniature world, his eyes scanning over the intricate details of the tiny buildings, the miniature trees, and the figures frozen in time. "This is incredible," he murmured. "The detail." His gaze then fell upon the unsettling additions to the otherwise idyllic scene, a figure of a cloaked man with a skull face and another tiny figure, seemingly screaming, looking upwards as if in terror. What's with the creepy skull figure and the man looking up and screaming like he's about to be crushed? He asked, a frown creasing his brow. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a knowing glance, merely shrugged. "Who knows what was going on in the mind of the model creator?" he said cryptically, his voice tinged with a hint of an unsaid story. "I'll take it," the man declared decisively, unable to resist the allure of such a unique piece. "Another one for the collection?" the shopkeeper asked, his tone casual, yet laced with something deeper. "Oh, yes," replied the man, already picturing where he would display it in his home. "But who is the real collector?" He mused loud, his question hanging in the air, unanswered. As the new owner of Hawthorne Village left the shop, the bell chimed once more, a sound that seemed to carry with it a weight of unspoken secrets. The shopkeeper watched him leave, his expression inscrutable. In the world of the miniature, within the confines of the cursed Hawthorne Village, the cycle had begun anew. The boundaries between collector and collection, between the captor and the captive, blurred and intertwined. Hawthorne Village, with its new addition, the tiny figure of Jonathan, forever frozen in a moment of terror, sat waiting, its legacy of entrapment and lost souls continuing under the guise of an innocent model village. As the door of the shop closed, leaving the shopkeeper in the dim light, surrounded by relics of the past, the truth of Hawthorne Village remained hidden, its story silently unfolding with each new owner, each new victim. The real collector, it seemed, was not the one who purchased the village, but the village itself, collecting souls, fulfilling the dark legacy of its creator, Edmund Gray. The flickering light of the hearth cast long shadows across the modest drawing room of the Houndstooth Inn. Seated comfortably in a well-worn armchair, James Harroway, a young journalist with a reputation for debunking supernatural myths, sipped his scotch thoughtfully. Across from him, his old friend and local historian, Thomas Whitaker, leaned forward with a look of anticipation. "You really believe you can debunk the legend of the Phantom Carriage, James?" Thomas asked, his eyes reflecting a mix of skepticism and amusement. James set down his glass, his face breaking into a confident smile. "Tom, you know I've made a career out of exposing these so-called supernatural occurrences. Remember the haunted lighthouse of Dover, a mere trick of light and sound, and the poltergeist of Penhurst, nothing but old pipes and a drafty house. This Phantom Carriage will be no different." Thomas chuckled. "But this is different, James. Blackmoor isn't like those other places. This legend has roots deep in the heart of the village. It's more than just a story here. It's part of our history. The more entrenched the myth, the more satisfying the debunking," James replied with a wink. "Think of it, Tom. Every year, on the anniversary of this unsolved murder, the townsfolk are paralyzed by fear. It's the 20th century, for heaven's sake. We should be beyond these ghost stories." Thomas leaned back, studying his friend. "But what if there's some truth to it? This town has never been the same since that night. People are genuinely afraid, James. They say the headless coachman seeks revenge for the unjust death of the murder victim." James scoffed. "Superstition and fear, that's all it is. People love a good ghost story, especially one that can't be explained. It's the perfect opportunity for me to show that it's all smoke and mirrors. I'll stay in Blackmoor, investigate the scene, talk to the locals, and by the time I leave, the Phantom Carriage of Blackmoor will be nothing more than an interesting footnote in the local history books." Thomas sighed, knowing there was no change in his friend's mind. "Well, just be careful, James. Blackmoor can be unwelcoming to outsiders, especially those who meddle in its past." James stood up, finishing his drink. "I appreciate the concern, Tom, but I've faced worse than a few unfriendly villagers. By the time I'm done, I'll have uncovered the logical explanation behind this Phantom Carriage, and Blackmoor can finally move on from this absurd legend." With a determined glint in his eye, James Harroway prepared to delve into the mystery of the Phantom Carriage, unaware that he was about to encounter something that would challenge his deepest convictions about the natural and supernatural world. The morning sun cast a pale light over the quaint, cobblestone streets of Blackmoor as James Harroway made his way to the local library. The air was crisp, and a thin mist clung to the ground, giving the village an eerie, almost timeless quality. He pushed open the heavy oak door of the library, the scent of old books and polished wood greeting him. Inside, he found himself in the company of dusty tomes and ancient manuscripts. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, watched him curiously as he approached the desk. "I'm researching the history of Blackmoor, particularly the legend of the Phantom Carriage and the unsolved murder that's tied to it," James explained. The librarian's expression turned solemn. "The tragedy of poor Eleanor Blythe," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "Follow me." She led him to a secluded section of the library, where she pulled out several old newspapers and a few handwritten journals. "This should get you started," she said, leaving him alone with the documents. As James delved into the archives, he discovered that the murder occurred on a cold, moonless night in 1898. Eleanor Blythe, a young woman of noble birth, was found dead in the woods near Blackmoor, her body lying next to an overturned carriage. The town was shocked, and rumours swirled about the circumstances of her death. The newspapers reported that Eleanor was to elope that night with a local stable hand, Thomas Warwick, a match her family vehemently opposed, but Thomas was nowhere to be found, and suspicion quickly fell upon him. Despite an extensive manhunt, he was never located, leading many to believe he had murdered Eleanor and fled. However, as James sifted through the journals, he found entries from various townsfolk that suggested a different story. These accounts hinted at a more sinister plot involving Eleanor's family, particularly her father, Lord Blythe, who was known for his ruthless ambition and disdain for anyone beneath his social standing. It was rumoured that Lord Blythe had discovered the elopement plan and, in a fit of rage, arranged for Thomas to be taken care of and staged Eleanor's death as a tragic accident. The mystery deepened as James read about sightings of the phantom carriage shortly after Eleanor's death. Witnesses claimed to have seen a spectral carriage driven by a headless coachman roaming the woods on the anniversary of the murder. Some believed it was the spirit of Thomas Warwick, eternally searching for his lost love, Eleanor. The more James read, the more he realised that this was not just a simple ghost story. It was a tale of love, betrayal, and vengeance that had left a deep scar on the town of Blackmoor. Determined to uncover the truth, he closed the dusty journal and set out to interview the descendants of those involved, hoping to piece together the events of that fateful night and lay the legend of the phantom carriage to rest. James Harroway left the library with a mind swirling with theories and half-formed hypotheses. He decided his next step was to visit the actual scene of the murder. The woods where Eleanor Blythe's body was discovered were on the outskirts of Blackmoor, a place locals avoided, especially as dusk approached. As he made his way through the dense undergrowth, the atmosphere grew heavier, the trees seeming to absorb sound, creating an eerie silence. James, ever the pragmatist, focused on the task at hand, pulling out his notebook and a measuring tape. He began examining the terrain meticulously, noting the width and slope of the old road where the carriage would have travelled. As he immersed himself in his work, a sudden killing sound pierced the silence. A distinct, thunderous clatter, like the approach of a horse-drawn carriage. It seemed to come from right behind him. Whirling around, James found nothing but the still, quiet woods. He frowned, trying to rationalize the sound. It must be the wind through the trees, he muttered to himself, though the wind was barely a whisper. Shaking off the unease, he returned to his investigation, measuring tire tracks and trying to visualize the scene on that fateful night. He sketched the layout, considering the possibility of an accident or a deliberate act. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the big trees, James decided it was time to head back. As he packed his equipment, a soft, almost inaudible whisper floated through the air. "Help me!" He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was faint, ethereal, like a fragment of a dream. He scanned the surrounding area, but there was no one in sight. The rational part of his mind insisted it was just his imagination, fueled by the day's research and the eerie setting. Yet, as he made his way back through the woods, the whisper echoed in his mind, unsettling him. Once back at the Houndstooth Inn, he sat down in his room, spreading out his notes and sketches. He tried to focus on the factual evidence, the measurements, the historical accounts, but the haunting sound of the carriage and the whispered plea refused to be dismissed. That night, as he lay in bed, the events of the day replayed in his mind. The logical, skeptical part of him was at war with the inexplicable experiences he'd had in the woods. Despite his disbelief in the supernatural, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the legend of the phantom carriage of Blackmoor. something dark and tragic, calling out to be uncovered. The following morning, James awoke feeling refreshed and eager to continue his investigation. He headed downstairs to the dining area of the Hound's Tooth Inn for breakfast, where he was greeted by a young waitress with a warm smile and sparkling eyes. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air in the heavy, historical atmosphere that had enveloped him since his arrival in Blackmoor. "Good morning. I'm Elizabeth," she said cheerfully as she poured him a cup of coffee. "What brings you to Blackmoor? Not many outsiders visit, especially not this time of year." James introduced himself and briefly explained his purpose in Blackmoor. As they chatted, he found himself drawn to her lively spirit and knowledge of the village. On a whim, he invited her to join him for dinner that evening, and to his delight, she accepted. He spent the day back in the library, poring over old maps and police reports, trying to piece together the events surrounding Eleanor Blythe's death. Despite his focus, his thoughts kept drifting to Elizabeth and their upcoming dinner. That evening, over a candle-lit meal at the inn, James found himself enjoying Elizabeth's company far more than he had anticipated. They talked about everything from local folklore to their personal aspirations, creating an unexpected connection. Curious, James asked if she knew anything about the Phantom Carriage. "I've heard the stories, like everyone in Blackmoor," Elizabeth replied, her eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "It's just local legend to me, tales to scare children, but after hearing you talk about it, I must admit, it's quite fascinating." As dinner came to an end, Elizabeth, caught up in the mystery and excitement, suggested a spontaneous walk to the site of the murder. "I've never actually been there at night," she said, a hint of adventure in her voice. "I'd love to see it for myself, especially with someone who knows so much about the legend." James was surprised but intrigued by the proposal. The idea of visiting the site at night was unnerving, yet the prospect of experiencing it with Elizabeth was too compelling to resist. They set off under the starry night sky, the path to the woods illuminated by the pale light of the moon. As they walked, the village's lights faded behind them, leaving them surrounded by the sounds of the nocturnal forest. The atmosphere at the murder site was eerily calm, with only the gentle rustling of leaves breaking the silence. As they stood there, James shared his findings and theories, noticing how Elizabeth listened intently, her fascination evident. The night air was cool, and a sense of unease hung over them as they contemplated the tragic events that had taken place on this very spot over a century ago. Unbeknownst to them, their visit to the site would unearth more than just old legends and would propel them further into the heart of the mystery surrounding the Phantom Carriage of Blackmoor. In the stillness of the wooded clearing, James and Elizabeth walked slowly, the crunch of leaves underfoot breaking the silence. James pointed out where Eleanor Blythe's body was found, describing the layout based on his meticulous research. Elizabeth listened, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. Suddenly, the distinct sound of hooves and wheels thundering against the ground shattered the calm. The noise was so intense, so immediate, that both instinctively jumped off the path, expecting a real carriage to barrel through. They turned, hearts racing, but saw nothing. The woods were as still and silent as before, as if the sound had never been. "Was that it? The carriage?" Elizabeth asked, her voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. James, struggling to maintain his composure, tried to rationalize what they had just heard. His eyes scanned the road, searching for a logical explanation. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A black carriage, stationary, with a restless horse pawing the ground, as if eager to bolt. "Look there," he whispered to Elizabeth, pointing towards the spectral carriage. As they watched, the carriage suddenly lurched into motion, racing towards them at an otherworldly speed. The sight was so surreal, so contrary to everything James believed, that for a moment he was frozen in shock. "Look out!" he yelled, pulling Elizabeth out of the carriage's path. They dove into the underbrush just as the phantom carriage swooped past. The ground where they had stood moments before now empty. As the carriage passed, James looked up and caught a glimpse of a figure in the back window. A young man, his face contorted in a silent scream. The image was burned into his mind, a haunting visage that seemed to be etched with pain and desperation. They lay there for a moment, panting, trying to process what had just happened. Elizabeth clutched James's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you see it too? The man in the carriage?" James nodded, his skepticism crumbling under the weight of the undeniable reality they had just experienced. "Yes, I saw him. It was like he was trapped, somehow." They slowly stood up, their eyes fixed on the spot where the carriage had disappeared. The forest was once again silent, the apparition gone as quickly as it had appeared. "What does this mean?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. "Is the legend true?" James was at a loss for words. All his beliefs, his convictions about the rational and explainable nature of the world, were being challenged. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm going to find out. We need to understand who that man was and why he's trapped in this phantom carriage." As they made their way back to the village, a new determination took hold of James. The mystery of the phantom carriage of Blackmore was more than just a legend. It was a puzzle that he was now compelled to solve, not just to debunk a myth, but to uncover a hidden truth that had been lost to time. James awoke the next morning, the early rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains. He turned to find Elizabeth's side of the bed empty, her presence from the night before now just a lingering warmth. A sense of unease gripped him as he quickly dressed and made his way downstairs, hoping to find her there. In the inn's dining room, he asked the staff if they had seen Elizabeth, but no one had. His concern deepened. The memory of the previous night's encounter with the phantom carriage loomed large in his mind. He couldn't shake the fear that she might have returned to the site of the murder. As he was about to leave the inn, a middle-aged man approached him. "Hello, I'm Arthur. I too am investigating the legend of the carriage and have some fascinating information I need to share with you," he said eagerly. James, torn between the urgency to find Elizabeth and his thirst for answers, reluctantly decided to hear Arthur out. They sat at a secluded table, and Arthur began to unfold his findings. "I believe Eleanor was killed by her father, who also murdered Thomas Warwick, and then blamed the murder on him," Arthur explained. "But here's the thing. The phantom carriage was a legend even before Eleanor's murder. It just became associated with her." Arthur leaned in, his eyes intense. "The phantom carriage requires a willing sacrifice, someone who goes to the site with love in their heart. It's an old part of the legend, long forgotten." James scoffed at the notion. No one would willingly go to a murder site to sacrifice themselves for love. It's preposterous. As they talked, time slipped away unnoticed. It was only when James glanced out the window and saw the darkness outside that he realized they had been talking for hours. A sense of urgency gripped him. "I need to go," he said abruptly, standing up. Arthur looked up at him with a knowing gaze. "I understand," he said, a hint of solemnity in his voice. James hurried out of the inn, his mind racing. The story Arthur had told seemed far-fetched, yet after what he had witnessed the night before, he couldn't dismiss it outright. As he made his way towards the woods, his worry for Elizabeth grew. The idea that she might have gone to the site of the murder, possibly drawn by the legend of the Carriage, filled him with dread. The woods were dark and foreboding as he entered, the moon casting eerie shadows between the trees. He called out for Elizabeth, his voice echoing through the silence. The legend of the phantom carriage, once just a curious mystery to solve, had now become a personal and urgent quest. James knew he had to find Elizabeth before it was too late, and confront whatever truth lay waiting in the heart of the Blackmoor woods. As James hurried him through the darkened woods to the site of the murder, his heart pounded with a mix of fear and desperation. When he arrived, what he saw was beyond his wildest imaginings. There, in a clearing bathed in moonlight, stood the phantom carriage, its form ethereal and ghostly. Beside it was Elizabeth, her expression one of sorrow and resolve, and gathered around were several villagers, their faces grim and determined. Confusion etched on his face, James approached the scene. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Elizabeth rushed towards him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and guilt. "You came, thank you," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. Before he could react, several villagers seized him. James struggled, but their grips were firm and unyielding. "If you had not come, it would have been me," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He has come willingly?" one of the villagers asked. "Yes," Elizabeth replied, her voice laced with sorrow. "With love in his heart." The man pressed further. "Yes, for me," she responded, her eyes not leaving James's. "And it is dusk," the man concluded with a note of finality. The villagers began to pull James towards the open door of the carriage. Inside, an ancient, half-skeletal figure waited, its presence chilling and commanding. As it reached out and grasped James, he felt an overwhelming force, his willpower draining away as he was pulled into the carriage. The door shut with a definitive thud, and the carriage sped off, disappearing into the distance. In the back window, James's face was visible, his hands banging against the glass, his mouth open in a silent scream. "Well done, my dear," a man said to Elizabeth, his voice a mixture of relief and gratitude. "We are again safe for the next cycle, because of you." Elizabeth's face was a mask of anguish, her eyes reflecting the weight of her actions. "Had we not made the sacrifice, as our fathers and forefathers did, the ghost of the carriage would have destroyed our village. But now, it's time to celebrate," the man continued, a sense of relief permeating his words. The villagers began to disperse, leaving Elizabeth alone in the clearing. The weight of her choice, the sacrifice she had made for the safety of her village, hung heavily in the air. As the moon shone down on the now empty site, the legend of the phantom carriage of Blackmoor had claimed another soul, and the cycle would continue, shrouded in secrecy and tragedy. In a quiet town, shadowed by an ancient family secret, an outsider's innocent act unleashes an unspeakable horror. The Graham family, bound for generations to a monstrous legacy lurking in their cellar, faces their darkest fear as the curse of their bloodline erupts into chaos. As the town succumbs to a terrifying transformation, becoming ground zero for a global apocalypse, the world teeters on the brink of a new, feral era. This is a tale of a curse unbound, a family's legacy turned nightmare, and a world conquered by the age of the beast. Can anything, or anyone, stop the relentless spread of the lichen curse? Dive into the heart of darkness in this gripping story of survival, legacy, and the indomitable nature of fear. Chapter 1. The Beast Below. The Graham family's old manor, perched on the outskirts of a sleepy town, had always been the subject of whispered rumours, but within its aging walls, a secret far darker than mere gossip lay hidden. On this stormy night, as lightning cleaved the sky, the heavy rain muffled the sounds from below the house. In the dank, shadow-draped cellar, an ancient chain rattled eerily. The darkness was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional flicker of a distant storm, revealing glimpses of something sinister. There, bound by heavy iron chains, was a creature of nightmares, a werewolf, its once human features twisted into a grotesque mask of feral rage. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, were filled with an unquenchable fire of hatred and hunger. With each thunderclap, it lunged violently, the chain straining against the brute force of the beast, echoing through the cellar like the bell of doom. Its growls were low and guttural, a sound born of centuries of confinement and fury. Above, in the house's cozy parlour, the Graham family gathered in a circle. Their heads were bowed, hands clasped tightly as they recited their nightly prayer. The ritual was as old as the curse itself, passed down through generations. Each word, murmured in unison, was a plea for protection, a chant to keep the darkness at bay. The room was filled with portraits of their ancestors, each face etched with the same solemn burden. The current generation of Grahams, John, the stern patriarch, Eliza, his devout wife, and their 2 children, young Ethan and curious Alice, all bore the weight of their lineage, a lineage marred by a chilling legacy, the beast that dwelled beneath their feet. As the prayer reached its crescendo, a loud clatter erupted from below, causing the family to pause, their hearts skipping a beat. It was a sound they had grown accustomed to, yet it never failed to instill a sense of dread. John's eyes met Eliza's, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The curse of their ancestor, a spectre from a bygone era, remained ever present, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked within their own blood. Outside, unbeknownst to the Grahams, a lone figure approached the manor, seeking refuge from the storm. This stranger, Tom, would soon unwittingly set into motion a chain of events that would unearth long-buried secrets and challenge the very foundation of the Grahams' existence. As the storm raged on, the boundaries between past and present, human and beast, began to blur, and the Graham family found themselves on the precipice of a terror that had been brewing for centuries. Chapter 2. The legacy passed down. The clock in the Graham family's old parlour chimed, its sound echoing through the corridors of the house, a constant reminder of the passing of time. But in this home, time held a different meaning. It was both a guardian and a menace. John, as a boy of 10, remembered one such evening distinctly. The rain was tapping gently against the window pane as he sat in the study with his father, Edward Graham. The room was filled with the scent of old books and the smouldering embers of the fireplace. It was there that Edward decided to unveil the heavy mantle of their family's legacy to young John. His father's voice was steady, but laced with an undercurrent of something John could not quite understand then. Perhaps it was fear, or maybe sorrow. "John," his father had begun, "you are old enough now to understand the truth about our family. The secret we guard is not just a matter of tradition, it is a matter of survival." He told John of their ancestor, a man of noble stature and good heart, who had fallen prey to a terrible curse. In the 1800s, transformed into a werewolf, he became a creature of the night, driven by primal instincts. "This beast in our cellar, your great-great-great-grandfather, is beyond redemption," Edward had said, his eyes reflecting the flames from the hearth. "He is driven by an insatiable hunger, a desire to hunt and kill. We cannot reason with him, for he thinks not as a man, but as a feral wolf." Edward had taken a deep breath before continuing. "We are the keepers of this curse, John. The chains and our prayers are all that keep the beast at bay. Should he ever break free, he will be an unstoppable force of evil and destruction. Each person he bites will become like him, a slave to the curse of the lichen, spreading the affliction far." John remembered feeling a cold shiver run down his spine as his father spoke. The weight of responsibility had suddenly felt very real, very heavy. "There is no cure for this curse," Edward had concluded. "Our family has tried for generations. We can only hope to contain it, to prevent the darkness from spreading." As John sat there, listening to his father, the shadows of the study seemed to grow longer, darker. The gravity of his inheritance had settled on his young shoulders that night, an inheritance of eternal vigilance against a horror that lay chained in their own home. Years had passed since that night, and John had grown into the role of the family's protector, but the words of his father lingered in his mind like an unending echo. There is no stopping the beast, only the hope of holding it at bay. Chapter 3. The Uninvited Guest. On that fateful night, as the storm raged outside, casting the Graham family's manor in a silhouette of foreboding shadows, there came a knock at the door. It was an unexpected sound that cut through the howling wind and the family's evening prayers. John, cautious and wary, opened the door to find a stranger standing in the downpour. The man, soaked to the bone, introduced himself as Tom, a traveller caught unawares by the violent storm. He pleaded for shelter, his eyes begging for compassion. But John, bound by the unspeakable secret they harboured, could not risk a stranger's presence. "You are not welcome here," he stated firmly, his voice barely concealing the fear of what lay beneath their home. With those cold words, he shut the door in the stranger's face, leaving Tom to the mercy of the storm. Rejected and desperate, Tom scanned the manor's grounds for any form of refuge. Ignoring the private property and keep-out signs, he scaled a high wall and a fence, finally stumbling upon an old tool shed. It was far from comfortable, but it would have to do until the storm subsided. As Tom settled in, trying to shake off the cold, he heard an odd sound. At first, it seemed like chanting, distant and almost melodic. Then came the unsettling noise of chains and a deep, guttural growling. Tom's heart raced. It sounded like a dog in distress. Driven by concern and curiosity, he ventured closer to the source of the sounds. He found a small opening, a narrow window that peered into what looked like a cellar. It wasn't big enough for him to climb through, but he could see inside. The rattling of chains and the growling grew louder. "You there, boy?" Tom called out, mistaking the sounds for a trapped animal. As he reached his hand inside, hoping to offer some solace to what he thought was a dog, the noises intensified. Suddenly, there was a sound like chains being violently pulled, as if an animal were trying to break free. "Come on, boy, I'll get you out," Tom said, his voice a mix of worry and determination. Without warning, a chain snapped. Something from the darkness latched onto Tom's arm. He yanked his hand back in reflex, feeling the sharp pain of teeth puncturing his skin. "Ah, stay in there then," Tom exclaimed, a mix of anger and shock in his voice. As he staggered back into the storm, nursing his wound, he was unaware of the gravity of what had just transpired. The bite, seemingly superficial, was more than just an injury. It was the awakening of an ancient curse. As he wandered off into the night, the true horror of what lay within the Graham family's cellar remained unseen. But now, it had made its first contact with the outside world. Chapter 4. The Beast Awakens. Hours after the harrowing encounter at the Graham Manor, Tom, still a stranger to the small town, found his way to a local cafe. The storm had subsided, leaving behind a palpable sense of unease. As he entered, his appearance drew immediate attention. His arm was bleeding, the wound appearing far from normal. "What happened?" asked a concerned patron, eyeing the injury with a mix of curiosity and worry. "Damn dog bit me," Tom grumbled, his voice rough and strained. He slumped onto a chair, his exhaustion palpable. "Give me a coffee," he demanded more than requested. The woman behind the counter obliged, her brows knitted in concern. "Here, put this bandage on it," she said, offering him a first aid kit. Tom sat motionless for a while, his coffee untouched, his head resting on his arm. The staff exchanged worried glances. One of them gently nudged him. "You okay, mister?" "Just so tired," Tom mumbled, his voice barely audible. In the background, the owner of the cafe began to restock the fridge with fresh supplies, including raw meat. At the sight and smell of it, something primal stirred within Tom. His senses heightened unnaturally, fixated on the meat. Without warning, Tom leapt over the counter, pushing the owner aside with alarming strength. He began to consume the raw meat with a wild, animalistic fervor. The sight was shocking, his actions incomprehensible. "Call the police!" shouted the owner, trying to pull Tom away. But Tom turned, snarling, a wild look in his eyes that was inhuman, feral. Soon after, the police arrived. They shouted at Tom to back away and lay down, but he was oblivious to their commands. As one officer approached, Tom's face contorted into a mask of bestial rage. He lunged at the officer, biting him viciously on the arm. The other officer, in a panic and self-defense, opened fire. Tom collapsed to the floor, his body going still. "He bit me," exclaimed the bitten officer, clutching his arm in pain and shock. An ambulance arrived promptly, whisking away Tom's body and the injured officer, who was already en route to the hospital for urgent treatment. Little did they know, the incident at the cafe was just the beginning. The curse that the Grahams had fought so hard to contain was now unleashed, its effects starting to ripple through the town in a way no one could have anticipated. Chapter 5. The Curse Unleashed. The night in the small town descended into chaos, a terror unleashed that was beyond anyone's worst nightmares. As the ambulance personnel loaded what they believed to be Tom's lifeless body into their vehicle, a sudden, unsettling movement caught their attention. "Is that normal?" one of the paramedics asked, a note of fear in his voice as he observed the body beginning to twitch and spasm under the cover. Before either could react, a horrific transformation occurred. The body mass visibly grew, morphing into something grotesque and unnatural. In a terrifying moment, the cover was violently thrown off, revealing not the man they had loaded, but a monstrous werewolf. With features of a wolf, but standing on two legs, the beast, in a fit of pure rage, leapt at the nearest ambulance worker, biting and clawing in a frenzied assault. The second paramedic suffered the same fate before the creature darted off into the night, its howl echoing ominously throughout the town. Shocked shop owners and bystanders came out to witness the commotion, only to be greeted by a scene of blood-curdling carnage. The two bodies of the ambulance workers lay motionless in pools of blood. Then, to the horror of the onlookers, the bodies began twitching. Muscles spasmed and contorted as the two men underwent a grotesque transformation, rising up as feral, raging werewolves. Panic ensued as the shop owners screamed, desperately trying to lock themselves in their establishments, but their efforts were in vain as the newly turned werewolves smashed through doors and windows, assaulting anyone in their path with ruthless savagery. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the officer who had been bitten by Tom in the cafe was undergoing a similar horrifying metamorphosis. In the emergency room, amidst the hustle and bustle of medical staff, the officer's body convulsed uncontrollably. As the staff tried to restrain him, thinking it to be a seizure, the transformation completed. He stood, now a monstrous werewolf, eyes glinting with primal fury. The hospital erupted into screams and chaos as the werewolf launched itself at the unsuspecting medical personnel and patients. Security guards and police, called to the scene, were met with a creature of nightmares, far beyond their training or understanding. Back in the town, the night was filled with howls and screams, a symphony of terror. The curse that the Graham family had contained for generations had broken free, multiplying and spreading like wildfire. The town was now facing an epidemic of lycanthropy, a disaster they were wholly unprepared for. As the night progressed, the situation grew more dire, with no apparent solution in sight, and the full moon watching over the town like a silent, ominous witness to the unfolding horror. Chapter 6. Desperate measures. In a matter of days, the once peaceful town had transformed into a nightmarish epicenter of lycanthropy. The rapid spread of the curse left the authorities with no choice but to call in the military. A perimeter was swiftly established around the town, a formidable barrier against the lycan outbreak. Tanks, heavy machine guns, and the latest in military technology formed an impenetrable line of defense. General Williams, in charge of the operation, surveyed the scene with a grim expression. If just one of these creatures gets out, the entire country is doomed, he stated gravely to his aides. His voice carried the weight of the dire situation, each word underscored by the seriousness of their task. As they strategized, a bone-chilling howl cut through the air. Two lycans, their eyes glowing with feral intensity, charged at the perimeter. The soldiers responded immediately, unleashing a barrage of heavy gunfire. The creatures were hit repeatedly, sustaining extreme injuries, but to the shock of everyone watching, they soon rose again, retreating back into the town with a resilience that defied logic. General Williams turned to his team, his face hardening. "We are pursuing the idea of using nukes," he said, a hint of reluctance in his voice. The very thought of such an extreme measure was a testament to their desperation. "Conventional weapons don't seem to have any lasting effect on them." He looked out over the desolate town, now a battleground between humanity and a curse centuries old. "I think we can contain them for now," he continued, "but we need a more permanent solution, and fast. This isn't just a fight against monsters, it's a race against time." The grim reality of their situation hung in the air. The military might have been able to hold the perimeter, but the question of how to eliminate the threat without resorting to catastrophic measures remained unanswered. As the general and his team delved into heated discussions, the sounds of howls and gunfire continued to echo in the background, a constant reminder of the battle that raged just beyond the barrier. Chapter 7. The Last Stand at Graham Manor. Within the confines of their ancestral home, the Graham family bore witness to the chaos that had engulfed their town. Their manor, a solitary beacon in the midst of the military-imposed perimeter, stood out as an island of relative calm in a sea of turmoil. As the lycans approached the manor, a primal roar echoed from the cellar. The beast, sensing its kin, clamored for freedom with a fury that shook the very foundations of the house. But the Grahams, steadfast in their duty, began their ancient prayers, a ritual passed down from father to son. These prayers seemed to create an invisible barrier, repelling the encroaching lichens. "Somewhere it spread," John murmured, his voice a mix of disbelief and dread. "All we can do is stay here and protect the beast. If he escapes, no one out there will stand a chance." Outside, the sound of gunfire grew closer, signaling the approach of the military. Through a window, John saw armed forces converging on their manor. It became evident that they had noticed something peculiar: the lichens' inability to cross onto the Graham property. A short while later, a knock sounded at the door, more assertive than any visitor before. John cautiously opened it to find a captain and a team of 6 soldiers. They entered quickly, securing the door behind them. One of them radioed in, "We're here." The captain, eyeing the Graham family, asked bluntly, "What's your story?" "You need to leave. This is private property," John replied, his tone firm yet laced with an underlying urgency. "I don't think so," the captain countered, his gaze piercing. "We've observed the lichens. They're being repelled from your manor, and we need answers." The tension in the room escalated as 2 worlds collided. The military, desperate for a solution to a crisis beyond their understanding, and the Graham family, guardians of a centuries-old curse. John knew that the secrets of the Graham Manor were now on the verge of being exposed. Whether this revelation would bring salvation or further damnation was a question that hung heavily in the air, as the howls of the lichens outside mingled with the steady rhythm of military discipline. Chapter 8. The Unleashing. The howl that resonated from the basement of the Graham Manor was unlike anything the military team had ever heard. It was a sound that seemed to embody pure, unadulterated menace. "What's that noise?" the captain demanded, his hand instinctively resting on his weapon. "That," John said with a gravitas that silenced the room, "is mankind's doom. If you venture down there, you will unleash a prophecy of man's end. The lichens outside are mere shadows compared to the beast in the cellar. It cannot be stopped, only subdued." The captain, skeptical yet intrigued, made a decision. "We'll take a look." John positioned himself defiantly in front of the cellar door. "My sworn duty is to keep it locked away, even if it costs my life. There will be no life if it escapes." But the military team, driven by urgency and desperation, pushed him aside aggressively. The Graham family, realizing their pleas were in vain, began to form a circle, chanting their ancient prayers with renewed fervor. As the team descended into the basement, the distant sounds of gunfire and howls filtered through the air, a chaotic symphony of the battle raging outside. The basement was dark, an abyss that seemed to swallow all light. As they opened the heavily bolted door, they peered into the gloom. There, in the shadows, they could just make out a figure. The beast, a nightmare made flesh. Upstairs, the Graham family continued their chant, a desperate plea for containment, but their voices faltered as they heard gunfire and screams emanating from below, followed by a haunting silence. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps ascending the basement stairs. The family's chant grew more intense, a futile effort to ward off the inevitable. They watched, hearts pounding in terror, as the creature, now free from its chains, walked past them, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. The beast paused for a moment, as if acknowledging the futile efforts of the family, before exiting the house into the night. The Graham Manor, once a stronghold against the curse, had fallen. The ultimate horror, the source of the curse, was now unleashed upon the world. The family's chants faded into a mournful whisper, their legacy shattered. The night air was filled with the sound of howls, a chorus of the damned, as the creature merged with its kin. leading an army of nightmares into the darkness. Chapter 9. The Fall of the Perimeter. At the military's fortified blockade, General Williams and his troops braced themselves for another assault. The air was tense, heavy with anticipation and fear. Soldiers manned their posts, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the lichens. "There they come again," General Williams muttered, his voice betraying a hint of fatigue from the relentless attacks. But this time, something was different. Among the approaching lichens, a massive figure stood out, dwarfing its kin in both size and aura of menace. "Look at the size of that one," the general exclaimed, a sense of dread settling in. The soldiers trained their weapons on the approaching horde, focusing on the colossal beast leading the pack. As they opened fire, a chilling realization dawned on them. Their bullets, which had at least slowed down the other lichens, seemed to have no effect on this behemoth. It kept moving forward, an unstoppable force of nature, as if each bullet was nothing more than a nuisance. Behind the beast, hundreds of townsfolk turned lichens followed, a horrifying testament to the curse's rapid spread. The soldiers' fire did little to stem the tide, as the lichens, emboldened by the presence of their formidable leader, surged forward with renewed ferocity. The beast reached the barrier, and with a display of brute strength, began to tear through the defenses as if they were made of paper. Soldiers, caught off guard by the sheer power of the creature, were overwhelmed in moments. The screams of the fallen filled the air as they, too, began to transform into the very monsters they had fought against. At military headquarters, far from the chaos, officers listened in horror over the radio. General Williams's voice, once steady and commanding, was now filled with terror and desperation. "They've broken through," he screamed, the sound of destruction and mayhem echoing through the transmission. The line went dead, leaving the room in stunned silence. The last bastion of defense had fallen, and with it, any semblance of hope they had of containing the outbreak. The curse, that had been a dark secret of the Graham family for centuries, was now a catastrophe on a scale never before seen, a nightmare unleashed upon the world. Chapter 10. The Age of the Beast. 3 months following the catastrophic breach at the military perimeter, the world had undergone a transformation so profound and terrifying that it was unrecognizable. The lichen curse, unleashed from the depths of the Graham family's cellar, had spread with an alarming speed and ferocity, engulfing cities, towns and villages across the globe. Human civilization, as it had been known, ceased to exist. The relentless spread of the lichens left no corner of the world untouched. Major cities, once bustling hubs of activity, lay in ruins, their skylines shattered, streets abandoned. The night was filled with the haunting howls of the lichens, a constant reminder of the new rulers of the planet. Society had crumbled under the onslaught. Governments and military forces, overwhelmed and outmatched, fell one after the other. Attempts at creating safe havens or developing a cure were futile, crushed under the overwhelming numbers of the lichens. Human survivors were few, scattered across the globe, hiding in remote areas, always on the move to avoid detection. The world had entered a new era, the Age of the Beast. The lichens, now the dominant species, roamed the lands freely. The curse had bonded them into packs, creating a new, brutal social order. The nights belonged to them, filled with their hunts and howls, echoing in the eerie silence of the abandoned human world. Nature began to reclaim what was once hers. Forests grew over crumbled buildings. Wild animals returned to the places once inhabited by humans, and the skies cleared of pollution. In a dark, twisted way, the planet was healing, returning to a state untouched by human hands. Humanity's legacy was reduced to whispers in the wind, echoes of a once thriving civilization now lost. The Graham family's curse had not only destroyed their lineage, but had rewritten the course of history, plunging the world into a primordial darkness where only the strongest, the Lycans, survived. In this new age under the rule of the beast, the earth had grown wild and untamed, a stark reminder of the fragility of human existence and the destructive power of ancient curses left unchecked.